and hi everyone. First of all, I'd just like to acknowledge that we meet on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders that we have here in the room with us today. I'm the postdoctoral researcher on an Australian Research Council project looking at responses to violent extremism and hateful extremism in development NGOs. So we're partnering with a large international NGO looking at the Philippines, Indonesia, Mozambique and Kenya, being led by Professor Anthony Ware and Professor Greg Barton. So in this presentation, I'll be discussing the preliminary findings of our systematic literature review, so an SLR, on the PCVE activities of development NGOs. So we looked at journal articles, books, industry papers. There was no date limit. It's up until the end of last year so far, all in English, worldwide, and any sort of empirical data. And we're looking at community-based PCVE interventions facilitated by development NGOs, so mostly preventative type work. We screened an initial 15,000 records and have extracted nearly 200, and I've so far read 80. So that's what's included in this analysis. So we're basically halfway through. These are the key themes that we found in the papers. So I'll briefly go through each throughout the presentation. So as Kessels and Nemo said, violent extremism is a development issue directly threatening poverty reduction, stability and economic growth objectives. So it's very relevant to the work of development NGOs. The connections between violent extremism and development go both ways. Security is necessary for development and insecurity reverses development gains. But also the push and pull factors that help drive people towards committing acts of violent extremism are the same conditions that development NGOs seek to ameliorate. So by working to address individual and community needs and social issues such as poverty, exclusion and injustice, development NGOs are tackling those root causes of violent extremism. Despite all these interconnections, broadly reframing development goals as PCVE-specific goals risks diminishing the impact of development programs and may neglect the importance of broader human security in favour of narrower state security, which is a shift that hurts security and development. In this view, development objectives are primary and a reduction in violent extremism is a secondary intended outcome. This comes back to a key assumption that strengthening resilience, community cohesion, economic opportunities, and social justice contribute towards reducing violent extremism. However, Brett et al. Caution against development NGOs blindly repackaging development projects as PCVE without specifically considering the intricacies of PCVE, noting that NGOs who have tried this approach have had minimal impact on PCVE goals. Terminology was raised in almost every paper in the literature review, with all authors noting the problematic nature of terminology and its appropriate usage within communities. Authors highlighted that the PCVE framework relies on outdated ideas of a consistent pathway to radicalisation and tenuous links between ideology and violence, which can be seen as contextually insensitive and interfering. With this meaning imbued in the terminology, the use of PCVE labels can undermine NGO activities and alienate community members. Community members may feel offended by the malignment of their ideology or their group, or they may fear retaliation from local actors, so local violent extremist actors. Additionally, community members and partners may become suspicious that the NGO is working within some governmental or broader agenda. While no papers provided clear solutions to the terminology problems, they did highlight the importance of differentiating between counterterrorism and PCVE and distancing NGOs from securitised approaches. The papers recommended that donors, NGOs and communities should develop suitable context and conflict-sensitive definitions of PCV by replacing terms such as extremism with neutral terms, such as social change, personal development, peace messaging, and coexistence. The ethical need to be transparent about programs with PCV objectives was raised, but how this should be framed or explained to communities was unclear, other than papers suggesting that these explanations need to be subtle and well considered. The following few slides highlight some key challenges, learnings, and recommendations captured within the papers that were analysed, and there's nothing like earth-shattering that you wouldn't already be aware of, but it just like goes to reinforce things that we're already pretty aware of. So stigmatisation was noted as a major theme where subgroups felt they were targeted for PCVE. Targeting and over-monitoring of certain communities is unhelpful and inaccurate, especially as paths to violent extremism are unclear, and over-surveillance can backfire and become a push factor in itself. So in one paper, they interviewed a bunch of experts at a roundtable, and they overwhelmingly agreed that grievances are at the root of radicalisation, and the disproportional attention given to ideological factors by PCV policymakers and experts is hindering progress on prevention. So it links back quite well to Professor Horgan's presentation at the beginning. Identifying ideology can have adverse effects, as demonising their beliefs can distance everyday people NGOs might want to be engaging. Community members would understandably be hesitant to affiliate with an organisation that presumes their vulnerability to recruitment and radicalisation to violence. Many of the papers recommended that there needs to be better coordination between all actors involved in PCVE efforts, so communities, NGOs, and governments. They recommended that stakeholders should convene regularly through platforms such as network meetings and communities of practice. National and international actors should support locally led work and build local capacity and partnerships between different institutions and community groups. Stakeholders should have clear lines of responsibility and understand their role and how that interacts with others in the space. That would include things like developing MOUs, and collaborative approaches should be incentivised and opportunities to work together sought out. There's quite a lot on coordination. That was like a fairly major theme. So that stakeholders should all share resources, risk, and reach. They should promote transparency and inclusion in decision-making to garner trust and buy-in. And that government can support coordination by acting as a backbone institution and being aware of what's happening on the ground. And they can improve coordination by removing barriers and red tape that affect NGOs' ability to operate. There was also some suggestion that we could engage corporates because they could have a lot to lose from violent extremism. The need for PCV work in development NGOs to be driven from the bottom up was clear in the literature and is a key part of development practice. Local groups usually have better rapport and trust in the communities where they work, as well as largely being comprised of local staff and people with deep contextual knowledge. By this model, external organisations can ask, how can we support you? And in line with that answer, externals can work with and not for communities, helping build community capability to design and deliver locally led programs that respond to contextually sensitive push and pull factors. The findings indicate these local approaches result in better implementation, impact, and sustainability. This has been mentioned quite a lot throughout the conference, but there was a lot on trust and issues of trust between communities and government and NGOs, and it being quite a multi-directional problem. So, and which is perpetrated by government securitisation of violent extremism. So this securitisation results in individuals and communities fearing surveillance, suspicion, internment, or extrajudicial killings. Due to communities' lack of trust in the government, NGOs may fear community rejection when working with government, But without government approval to operate, community members can be too scared to engage with NGOs. Many NGOs advocate oppositional or critical beliefs regarding the government and its policies, which may strain relationships and hinder collaboration with the government. This can result in government distrust of NGOs and suspicion of wrongdoing, which then can lead to a chilling effect on donors. It's noted that NGOs often have a positive relationship with communities and that PCVE activities are more likely to be successful if this relationship is prioritised, and that the NGO should be engaged from the outset to enable time for the development of trusting bonds and local knowledge. Inter- and intra-communal trust deficits require strong and inclusive programming and facilitation, which could include steering away from some counter-narratives if the counter-narratives undermine beliefs widely held in the community. There needs to be a safe space for exploration of ideas, even unpopular ones. Including diverse stakeholders in decision-making and treating people as co-creators rather than as beneficiaries can help develop trust, particularly when this is done authentically with sufficient time and resources allocated to that. Resourcing challenges obviously came up a lot, especially around funding, which isn't much of a surprise that funding was insufficient, short-term, and also tied to particular uses or particular projects. Further, there was an over-reliance on foreign donors and no sustained funding stream for upscaling pilots. Funds focused on projects rather than NGO infrastructure and personnel. And some papers highlighted that PCV can have high resource intensity, although it was unclear whether that was different from other development programs, which are all kind of quite resource intensive. Clearly, NGOs prefer flexible funds for operating costs rather than tendering to deliver an externally designed, time-limited project. Having more control over their funds would support NGOs to invest in things such as capacity development for their staff and partners around conflict management, PCVE frameworks, project management, communications, and monitoring and evaluation. Additionally, substantial and long-term funding is required to facilitate the local co-design of projects and the setup of those projects, which is all very time-consuming. It also could fund training and interactions to ensure personnel have relevant cultural understanding and local credibility, and provide money for consultants who can provide short-term technical expertise when any of it's requested by the community. A fairly glaring gap in the literature was there was little to nothing on Indigenous, LGBTQIA+, or disability, and a host of other sort of marginalised issues and groups. Gender really meant women, and the literature argues that we should mainstream consideration of women into PCVE work. With the attention on women, papers analysed for the SLR outlined that programs focused on mothers can be very stereotypical and restrictive around women's roles in ways that limit PCVE efforts. For example, the unrealistic expectation that women should pick up on and address a family member radicalising can lead to a blame culture where radicalisation becomes her fault. While there are many women-led PCVE initiatives in existence, these are often ignored and underfunded. Further, some traditional leaders are hesitant to include women and youth, arguing that they don't have much to contribute. To combat these sort of sentiments, NGOs need a gender strategy and advocacy around that to support implementation. They need to build their capacity to work with girls and women, which includes supporting women's positive roles in PCVE without instrumentalizing or securitising them. There was strong agreement across papers that there needs to be more attention paid to ensuring sustainability through succession planning and through building in reflection. This requires long-term funding to give time for PCV programs to become established and for results to show. The effectiveness reported throughout the literature review papers was mixed, although several of them reported participant gains in tolerance of different perspectives, knowledge, and confidence. Despite showing some positives, many of the results were unconvincing. So this first one, Action et al., commented that the program they evaluated was quite effective and quite successful, although they were unsure if the right audience had been selected to participate in the program. Aldrich reported no statistical difference between the control group and the test group for a radio program in multiple African countries. Nonetheless, he remarked the program was cost-effective with a broad reach. Al-Masri and Slavona examined several sites and found that across organisations and approaches, with few exceptions, there was no evidence that the interventions were contributing to prevent violent extremism. Alves dos Rios was unable to show statistically significant evidence that the programs his organisation funded prevented or countered violent extremism, although there was some anecdotal evidence that the programs averted recruitment in a few cases. Brett and Kalmeyer found that the PCVE program that they were evaluating showed positive results. However, when analysing the data through a gender lens, they found that the program was successful for men, but much less so for women. Ugal et al.'s meta-analysis of 8 outcome evaluations found that the effects varied strongly across the included studies, and some other papers really overclaimed the meaning of their results. For example, a project where 21 participants claimed that the combined assessment results evidence that the program was effective at reducing and preventing counter-extremism. Positive outcomes led Fedis et al. To suggest that an intervention aimed at empowering individuals in combination with strengthening empathy is successful in countering violent radicalisation. It was unclear how they came to that conclusion as the participants weren't radicalised beforehand, so I'm not sure how they'd know that that counters it. So as shown in the previous examples, the results of PCV programs included in the literature review were highly mixed, ambiguous, often overstated, and often based on outputs with impacts assumed. Some programs chose indicators that they couldn't directly influence, which were dependent on other external factors, where outcomes and indicators should be aligned to what is within the scope of the program and the implementing organisation to effect. Programs can measure increased resilience, social cohesion, understanding, access to resources, and other things like that. And many of the programs showed statistically significant change on these. The missing link is evidence supporting the assumptions that these outcomes contribute towards actually preventing or countering violent extremism. The majority of papers marked on a lack of quality monitoring and evaluation, the difficulty of evaluating preventative outcomes and impacts, and the limited evaluation capacity among NGO personnel was raised. Baselines and theories of change were rarely in place, and most of the evaluations were conducted ex post, so at the end of the program. And it was noted that PCVE relies largely on untested assumptions with insufficient evidence of what works for who and in what context. Yep, cool. To address the weak M&E systems in PCVE programming, the paper suggested that organisations should ensure that monitoring process linked to theory of change outcomes and indicators are in place and operationalised from the program beginning. Further, NGOs should conduct regular needs assessments and conflict analysis and gather this information as monitoring data. Evaluations that showed that the most robust results evaluated skills, awareness, behaviour, attitudes, social cohesion and resilience, rather than attempting to measure a decrease in potential violent extremism. To link these measurements to the objective of reducing violent extremism, there needs to be deep evaluative research conducted to excavate the assumptions beneath PCVE. For example, there needs to be stronger evidence that increased tolerance of difference, community connection, inclusion, and other things like that contribute to reduce violent extremism. So it'll be interesting to see if any of these change as we finish going through the final half of the papers, but we seem to have reached saturation on that. So yeah, and we're hoping that to have the paper completed shortly and it will be published and shared with the AVERT network. So thanks very much.
Okay, thank you, Leanne. And next up, we have Professor Anthony Ware, and his paper is titled Violent and Hateful Extremism in Mindanao, Its Implications for Conflict-Sensitive Development, Programming by International NGOs. Over to you, Anthony.
Thank you very much. And good afternoon, everybody. So as Leanne introduced, the three panellists today, we're part of an ARC research project looking at this topic of development NGOs addressing violent extremism. When we first raised the idea for this as a what I'm wanting to run through in this presentation is a very brief presentation on the research itself. And then the local perceptions in Mindanao from our recent research on the conceptualisation of violent extremism, the nature of the conflict, and on violent extremism recruitment in Mindanao. And then their perceptions or their feedback in terms of the implications for non-government development organisation programming, what's working, the challenges and opportunities. So when we first raised this idea in a seminar or workshop in Melbourne about 6 years ago with a range of development organisations based in Australia, there was a fairly strong almost rejection, certainly aversion to engaging with the topic for many of the sort of reasons that Leanne in the literature review has just outlined. One particular agency came to us and said, actually, this is an issue because violent extremism impacts on a large number of our projects, and a large number of our projects are being conducted in highly conflicted settings where we potentially could have a greater impact on conflict and on violent extremism. This NGO is in the midst of a global project that we're connecting with in a sense, looking at conflict sensitivity and trying to mainstream their conflict analysis, develop the right tools and protocols to analyse any sort of conflict, given that 70-80% of their global programming is in conflict-affected situations, to better analyse that in order to maximise the potential positive benefits, to minimise unintended negative consequences and so on. And so this research project is really looking at ways to embed analysis of the, and we're saying violent and hateful extremism context into that conflict sensitivity analysis they do to help look for, again, the negative impacts that it's having on their programming that they might have in unintended consequences if they don't think the dynamics through well, and maximise the positive benefit they may have. We're also hoping to be able to develop some sort of indicators of progress to address some of this monitoring and evaluation gap, and hoping to come up with specific recommendations for at least the 4 countries that they've steered us towards, which is the Philippines, particularly Mindanao, and Indonesia, Mozambique and Kenya. So we've conducted our first visits to the Philippines and Indonesia, and I'm reporting now the data from that first preliminary visit to Mindanao. And very much their perceptions on that. So this was only 2 months ago. We interviewed, so Greg and I for half of the interviews, and then myself and the partner investigator from the NGO, the other half of the interviews, 41 interviews in Manila, in Iligan City, in Cagayan de Oro, I'll get that right, and then via Zoom to other parts of Mindanao that were kind of off limits for us visiting-wise. So this is the local perceptions, so their feedback to us. This is kind of their views that I want to sort of run through here in terms of the way they conceive, or when we put the idea of violent extremism to them and their reactions to that. Firstly, a very widespread concern over the use of the terminology in Mindanao. Most interviews suggest that it was very sensitive, very controversial, a great sense of reluctance. Now, this is largely, I should say, with almost everybody was a local. Some worked for international NGOs. Many of them worked for local CSOs that were doing development work rather than primarily focused on CVE or PVE kind of programs. So a strong reluctance or refusal even to use the term. They suggest feeling that it's very politically laden language that comes from those in power and is applied against those who are already marginalised. It's seen as foreign in nature, not born in and developed in Mindanao context, and therefore carrying with it stereotypes that have been developed elsewhere that are not always helpful and often don't fit the local context. Instead, they much prefer to describe the detail of what they see. For example, ISIS-backed Malte brothers, Marawi being ISIS-backed, led by the Malte brothers, laid siege in Marawi, discuss how the government and the security forces responded to the situation without trying to put a term to it at all. And a very strong feeling that the terminology or use of violent extremism as a term can limit the legitimate right to a struggle for self-determination, and that it conflates multiple levels of violence that I'll unpack in a moment. Many of them were using violent extremism terminology in their grant applications, and therefore in their project design documents, and then not mentioning it in any of their community engagement or work. Violent extremism seemed to be very messy in the Philippines, in part because the government describes the New People's Army, communist insurgency, as violent extremism as well. And so talk in terms of violent extremism that is inspired by Middle Eastern Islamism, plus communist terrorism in Mindanao and other parts of the Philippines. Interestingly, most of the local NGO staff, CSO staff, do recognise the distinction between insurgency and violent extremism, recognise insurgency as something that addresses, that it is a conflict with the state that targets security, the security sector and state apparatus, with violent extremism being far more ideological against the people as a whole and against social structures. And yet they argue that in Mindanao, the boundaries are very blurred. And that most locals would prefer to talk of extreme violent responses to perhaps legitimate local economic and social grievances. So as I just said, most are concerned that the application of the label can lead to limits or opposition to legitimate struggle for self-determination and recognition. As one in a local informant who was born in Sulu and now leads a local organisation in Zamboanga City, put it that Abu Sayyaf was born out of frustrations with the peace process. Leaders all came from the MNLF, but saw that while those negotiations were ongoing, they were no longer included. So for me, the journey of their extremism and terrorism is also part of the peace process. If we go back to the original political agenda of Abu Sayyaf, they used the term Al-Qatania Islamiyah for their self-determination struggle, even before the term Islamiyah was popularised by IS groups. And it's only by abandoning international humanitarian law that they made themselves targets to be called violent extremists. And so you sort of see the blurring that they're bringing out here. That violent extremism is clouded with ideas of insurgency in the national level discourse by Filipino politicians and other key leaders as well. The state has a tendency to label all non-state armed groups as terrorist, and the fact that violent extremism is a term applied by government, not by society or even local regional actors, has a strong political connotation. So there's also a perception in the Philippines that some of the state actors have become terrorists themselves or perpetrated acts of terror. by abandoning humanitarian law, by abandoning international norms, by perpetrating extreme violence against large sections of the population in a fashion that seems quite ideological. And so while most definitions of violent extremism would exclude state actors, there's a strong perception in Mindanao that state security services have themselves become, or at times been, terrorists or been infiltrated by by perpetrators. And all of this is complicated by sporadic feudal clan violence by Rido, which is often intergenerational, hateful, based on payback for alleged injustices and by political or economic rivals. It's largely about land, often about honour, and often connected to local political power. So their perceptions then on the nature of the conflict, and thinking Marawi in particular, we were in Iligan, which is what, 25 kilometres or so from Marawi city. This sense that Mindanao blurs the lines between insurgency and violent extremism, and that's complicated by clan violence and land rights issues by Indigenous peoples, and the sense of land grabbing. The questions as to how much radicalisation is really taking place in groups, or has taken place in groups like Abu Sayyaf. A suggestion by the UN Resident Coordinator's Security and Conflict Advisor, for example, that Abu Sayyaf have said things and done things to gain a global branding and a recruiting edge with foreign fighters, but questioning how much radicalisation has really taken place against most of those who had aligned with Abu Sayyaf. Looking at the time and how far we're going, what happened in Marawi is definitely more multidimensional than was presented. One of the academics from Mindanao State University highlighted to us many of them highlighted the issue of the political history of oppression of the Moro people. Sorry, I won't read the whole quote there. Some of the stuff we haven't actually said. Let's look at recruitment, because there seems to be some fairly significant differences, I would suggest, between recruitment, as we've been talking about largely in the Australian or Western kind of context for a reasonable part of this conference, and the way these people were describing recruitment. One of the senior academics at University of Philippines, who's spent a good deal of time looking at this, has interviewed a number of returnees from the Marawi siege, who were in prison, and wanted to really emphasise what he called the myth of the idea that social media is a major recruitment site for the violent extremism in Mindanao. At least for these people, they were all recruited through kinship ties, not social media. The pool was not even beliefs or religion. The bulk joined through family relationships and the previous experience they'd had of war and violence. Most of them had previously participated in clan conflict, and this was translated into extremist violence and terrorist action alongside foreign fighters. Another academic from Mindanao State University in Iligan had interviewed a number of fighters with the Maute group who laid siege to Marawi prior to that siege, which is really interesting research. And they were saying that they were supporting the Maute brothers in their program, not because they supported their ideology, but because they're our brothers and our sisters in the same clan, and we see they are being attacked by the government. Which again is a really interesting sense of recruitment. So the push factors, definitely historical injustice against the Moro, their sense of disempowerment, lack of agency, leaving them feeling like powerless victims. But most of the interviewees post-Marawi say they joined because of that sense of impression, but also land issues. that perhaps they'd adopt, and this is their claims, saying that they had adopted jihadist language and ideas and strategies to further their local cause for land, for self-determination, for recognition. So this is their reported, their self-reported motivations, and we've been talking about that a bit here. And certainly the Malte brothers in their attempts to radicalise, their attempts to recruit, tried to tap very heavily into anti-Filipino sentiment, the fears that they felt and the hate that they felt to, as Moro. And noting, for example, the way some Filipinos have portrayed the Moro as the boogeyman who, particularly as children growing up, that you don't eat vegetables or you don't go to sleep, that the Moro will come and get you, and being portrayed in that less than human kind of a sense. Pull factors, perhaps security, thank you. Security more than ideology. Quite a few really pertinent interviews suggesting, for example, one interview of a child soldier with Abu Sayyaf that had exited, indicating that they were initially part of a clan. They were introduced to guns and to violence as a clan in clan violence, but then the Abu Sayyaf group offered more money to their family in terms of financial support if they went and joined Abu Sayyaf, which is how they ended up with Abu Sayyaf. So certainly others suggesting that where you part of a small clan that feels that they are outgunned, outmaneuvered, that aligning with a more powerful group, which may be violent extremist group rather than a clan-based group, as being a way to bolster their sense of power and and then of course complicated by the clan violence and by Rido. So, what do they suggest is working? I'm not going to read all of these, I don't think, or at least just pull out the key words, but projects that encourage dialogue, recognition of cultural and religious difference, cultural exchange, visiting places and people of different culture, intercultural. One really interesting story of that one of the young workers shared with us of a group of Filipino and Moro or two different groups getting together to go and visit Indigenous populations, and their journey of discovery of the rights and needs of Indigenous populations bring both the Moro and Filipino together. So not necessarily just a mutual exchange of the two. Certainly need for gender-based, rights-based gender training, suggesting that works quite well. Because of the increasing strictness of gender roles being linked with rising extremism. Addressing poverty, participation, building sense of community, even-handed service delivery. There's a whole list there. I won't read all of them. Some of the key challenges, and this came out in the literature, one being that sense of the core values of non-government organisations, particularly being non-government, and yet at least a perception of aligning with security agendas being a very significant one to try to negotiate. Likewise, the sense that community level activities with the name CVE or PVE or VE anywhere leaves people feeling very unsafe and probably has very low traction and participation. Thank you. Also, one of the other interesting ones is the local government units and elections every 3 years, and saying that with 3-year funding cycles from donors and 3-year election cycles, they often get a little bit political, a little bit violent or threatened violence. That non-alignment of those causes great issues within the midst of project funding. So needing to find ways to try to align the two. And of course, then the big question of what's going to follow the Marawi response when our 5 years down and most of that funding or much of that funding is drying up and many of those projects are now closing. What's next? Opportunities that they identified. addressing poverty, marginalisation, discrimination, work on social cohesion, alternate dispute resolutions, particularly those that build on traditional or tribal adjudicatory tribunals, particularly women, noting that all the clans do have negotiating and mediating processes already built in, that when there's so much clan violence, but there are also mediators and processes in place, and not co-opting those, but engaging with those and strengthening those and thinking about those in the context of violent extremism, not just clan violence. Early warning, some really good early warning information already being generated, but finding ways to link up particularly community level programs and women's observations of what's happening around them, find ways of reporting those. So there's nothing particularly surprising on all of these. And again, these aren't necessarily our recommendations at this point, but community, CSO, civil society organisation kind of recommendations of what they think will work. And we shall go from there with our next stages of our research. Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony. And next up, we have Professor Greg Barton. His presentation is titled Disengagement, Rehabilitation, and Targeted CVE Interventions in Indonesia and the Implications for the International Development Community. Over to you, Greg.
Thank you. I'll try and be quick so we've got more time for discussion. We've got some excellent presentations this afternoon after lunch in session 5 and 7 on Indonesia, so I won't go into all the details, but this links to that. And I should start by saying, by way of contextualizing things, this is a project that Anthony and Leanne and I are working on, but it began with a project that we'd worked on earlier, pilot project with Matteo Vagani, and the work that Matteo and I do with Sean, CSO, informs a lot of this project, because this is a project that's looking at Indonesia and the Philippines, where Sean, CSO, is involved. A new element for us next year will be looking at Mozambique and Kenya. Let me just try and contextualize a lot of what we're getting at. It's, as Leanne has said in the literature survey and work that she's done, and as Anthony has said, coming in his background from humanitarian international development, there's an awkwardness about trying to join CVE up with development, and yet there's also a compelling reason for doing so. If it's done well, it can lead to better CVE interventions and programs, but you can understand the baggage and the problems that get the start going. I think it's going to be inevitable. I think we're going to see, if we have this conversation in 5 years' time, we'll see a lot more integration, a lot more awareness, and hopefully a lot more comfort and ease with making this connection, but it's understandable that it's an awkward sort of meeting at the moment. So our project runs for 3.5 years. As I said, we're looking at 4 countries. Because of this earlier project we did with Matteo, we have framed this not just in terms of CVE, but we're talking about hateful extremism. I'll come to that in a minute. And one of the aims that we're trying to develop out of this is, apart from getting the terminology better developed and better grounded, is developing some analysis tools, risk and need assessment tools, indicators. We're not over-claiming what's possible in that space, because you're well aware that there are limitations of what we can have in a predictive sense, but we can have a better awareness, a sensitivity of conflict environments. So this has come out of a broad general trend. It's not something that we've invented. It's something that's been underway for some time. In Australia, of course, we have in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade a folding in of AusAid, and now a folding in of work on CVE and work on development. Now that's potentially problematic. People are uncomfortable, and yet there's compelling reasons for doing that. We're also seeing in the Department of Home Affairs a folding in of work on CVE and CT, and there are good reasons for having those 2 different sorts of focus speak to each other, because there's no hard line. There's an intersection that needs to be better understood. The push from the UN Secretary General's Plan of Action to prevent violent extremism spoke of a triple nexus between development, humanitarian, and peace building. So in principle, that's good. Of course, the execution is the challenge. There's theoretically a natural fit, but there is this baggage and this problematic stigmatization and misuse of framing around violent extremism. Just to explain this new framing of hateful extremism. We've long said that people, we're concerned about behaviour, so violence is a problem, belief is not a problem. But of course, is a problem with the way certain beliefs justify not just violence, but a dehumanizing, a contempt, a hate of others. And that's a problem in itself. So hate speech and hate incidents are themselves a kind of violence, even if they don't lead to a more direct violence. And hateful extremism, of course, we often think of as being involved with a white supremacist toxic nationality, but it's not just white supremacist. In Asia and Africa, there's expressions of toxic identity politics and nationalism that have the same elements, and so I think it should be understood in the same way. Matteo and I were thinking about this in 2019, when in October 2019 we noticed, sort of independently, but as a kind of confirmation, that the Commission for Countering Extremism in England and Wales came out with a fairly clear expression of articulation of hateful extremism, and a fairly neat and fairly effective summary that more or less parallels what we've been talking about. So we're talking about behaviours that, in their words, incite and amplify hate or engage in persistent hatred. We're talking about hateful and hostile supremacist beliefs. Of course, white supremacist beliefs are a particular problem in the West, but this is a global problem. And this is behaviour that's causing, or at least is likely to cause, harm to individuals and communities. I was struck in 2015 at the UN General Assembly. There was a focus on CV. David Cameron addressed it, very eloquent in that sort of English way, but not really answering his own question when he said, we need to deal with extremism before it becomes violent. So we need to tackle extremism before violence manifests. But he never explained where you address extremism before violence manifests. And of course, the problem is it then leads to a slippery slope of thought police and enforcing certain ideas, or policing around ideas, certain ideas being dangerous, which understandably is very alarming. I think, however, there is a place where you can address violence, extremism before it becomes violent, and that's this expression of contempt and hate. Just the framing of that, I think, is legitimately a place where the state and society should intervene and say this is not acceptable, and that is a behavioural thing. It's not that people hold beliefs, although of course the behaviour comes out of beliefs, but it's the behaviour that can be criticised rather than the beliefs themselves. So I said it's not just a white supremacist problem. Hindutva extremism in India makes it very clear. Of course, there are historical crossovers with what's happened in Europe with toxic nationalism and fascism. Another very clear example that Anthony's written extensively on is what's occurred in Myanmar, particularly manifesting as anti-Rohingya extremism, but justified around a kind of Burmese ultranationalism endorsed by certain key Buddhist leaders. It's a reminder this can occur in any society. So certainly it's a big problem in Western societies with white supremacism, but it's a problem that goes well beyond that. Matteo has been leading a project looking at this question of hate in the Australian context and intersects with these things. So it's difficult getting good data, good reporting, but I think this is an area of research that is essential for further work on understanding extremism. And I said yesterday that when we think about a situation like Western Mindanao, it's helpful to think of violent extremism and hateful extremism, but conflict violence is its own thing. It intersects and resonates with and engages with violent extremism. So Abu Sayyaf group is a violent extremist group, but many of the people who join Abu Sayyaf group might join because of fear of redo violence and looking for protection. And as Anthony said, there's a lot of evidence that a lot of people are not particularly informed about the ideas and in that sense cognitively radicalized. We did a pilot report on this previous project, and it became very clear from there were differences across, in that case, 3 countries, Myanmar, Philippines, Indonesia, differences in perceptions of problems. But this question of hate became a very clear concern that people said, yes, in Indonesia, for example, that the government, the police are dealing with violent extremism pretty well, but we're worried about everyday manifestations of extremism, intolerance, contempt, and hate. And it was very clear that this is the business of humanitarian development, even though it's an uncomfortable engagement and a challenging start. And if development is done well, it will be not only cognizant of these issues, but it will make a difference to that environment. So we had a series of recommendations from this. This is an internal pilot report, but we're having it more or less the same content published in an article in the Third World Quarterly that's out about now. So if you're curious, you can find more there. The Indonesian context is very different from the Philippines context. We're dealing with a overwhelmingly moderate majority. I mean, you can debate moderate, that's a whole story in itself, but I think that's a broad characterization that stands up. But an energetic minority. And the bigger problem for the energetic minority is not violence, but contempt and hate. A classic manifestation of this was a group that calls itself the Islamic Defenders Front. It's banned by the government recently. That was contentious because there was a suggestion they were being banned because of ideas. The government wasn't clear on saying they were banning them because of bad behavior. There was a lot of bad behavior that was that justified that intervention. But I think that thinking about why a ban occurred wasn't clearly articulated. The same thing with Hizb ut-Tahrir Indonesia, which was banned several years before, not so much because of their ideas about the caliphate, but because of the way in which they promoted those ideas in a way which intersected with recruitment for the Islamic State Caliphate project. So we have in the Sean CSO network a number of CSOs working very directly on interventions that are relevant to this. For example, Empathy Coup, the ISN Empathy Coup, has done a lot of work on countering hate and contempt, but specifically is now engaged with projects on rehabilitation of people who are returning from Syria or coming out of prison. And what's striking there, I know that we're short of time, so I won't go into details, but what's striking there is that you might think that rehabilitation and reintegration programs, particularly those that begin in prison, are not going to intersect with development programs very well at all. But in fact, they only work if you can reintegrate people into communities that will receive them. And that's a challenge. And it's a challenge that requires working across the whole of society in a way that people working in development understand much better than people working in CV often understand. One particular initiative which is interesting, we're investigating, is a program called the Peace Village program, that was set up by the Wahid Foundation, that's supported by UN Women. It's a broad, holistic approach to community development that obviously has a focus on the leadership and agency of women and girls, but broadly involves education in ways that intersect very nicely with our partner, international NGO, for our research project. We think that looking at programs like this will give us much better understanding of how we can focus on doing useful work in society that certainly has a benefit in reducing the vulnerability and openness to extremism, but also helps on the other side on rehabilitation, reintegrating people into society. So this is the beginning of our project. So we're not claiming final results, but we think this is confirmation, because we did this earlier work, that this is stuff that has to be done. And even though the conversations are often difficult, we found, for example, recently in the Philippines and Indonesia, our partner, International Development Agency partner, was sort of open but not sure that this was for them because the language, as Leanne's discussed, the terminology is problematic. And yet once we got into it, they said, oh, well, of course, that's what we're doing anyway. So, and that's a very natural and appropriate response. So thank you.
Thank you, Greg. So we have a lot of time for questions, and I already see one hand up, two hands up. Great. Is there going to be a microphone? Okay. Alex, I think you had your hand up first, and then after that, Lydia.
Thank you. Really interesting panel, and it's exciting because it overlaps actually a lot with our project that we'll be talking about in the next session. So very, very cool. I guess my question is open to the entire panel. It's probably a little bit more directed towards Professor Ware, and it has to do with the nature of donor priorities and this sort of awkward marriage between that and PCVE and broader conflict violence. Do you think that this attempted diffusion of global PCV norms and these tensions at the local level, so attempts at localization, are actually closely linked to the nature of current donor funding? So in other words, I guess, is donor funding actually complicating PCV strategies on the ground, particularly the nature of it and the conditions, I guess, that are linked to it?
Certainly the local actors in Mindanao would say, I think, our data says, they would say yes. And they'd say yes in two ways. Firstly, that donor priorities are often developed elsewhere based on understandings of violent extremism and CVE, PVE work in other contexts, and then applied more globally that don't necessarily fit the local context. And secondly, because most local and international NGOs, their local offices, are they're dependent on sort of regular 3-year grants or whatever, whatever link, but specific grant sort of funding for much of their operations. And these grants tend to trend in cycles or in buzzwords and themes. And so suddenly after Marawi, in particular after Marawi, PCVE has become flavour of the month, but it's very hard to get funding for almost anything else. So suddenly most local agencies have had to adapt their language, if not their programs, to fit a new set of donor priorities that they feel puts strain on some of their values and some of their practices and some of, in short.
Thank you. Thanks so much for that session. It was really interesting. It was really striking the way that you spoke about the tensions of integrating development and countering violent extremism. My question's for the panel, but also probably more specifically to you, Anthony. I was wondering if you could speak a bit about when development can sometimes not the tensions between countering violent extremism with development, but then when development work can actually facilitate violent extremism. Maybe facilitate is too strong of a word, but I'm thinking here in a context that you've done a lot of work in Myanmar, for example, in the Rakhine State, where international NGOs were basically responsible for delivering services of a community that was, they were essentially running camps for IDPs at the behest of a state that was encouraging violent extremism, conflict, and then we saw where that all led to. And it also related to some of the points that you had in the presentation, where some of the actors that you were speaking to were saying, well, the state is actually we view the state as a violent extremist actor or a terrorist actor. So I was just wondering if you could comment on that.
That's slightly off topic on our presentation today, but certainly, yes, I've done a lot of work in Rakhine State in Myanmar around the Rohingya over the last decade or so, not the last 2 years, 20 months. This really does speak to the issue of state actors perpetrating, or at least certainly the rhetoric inflaming violence and extreme violence. And in the case of Myanmar, obviously the military then went on and committed ethnic cleansing, together with some ethnic Rakhine Buddhist nationalists. Whether and how development and particularly humanitarian relief operations contributed to that. It was an incredibly tense situation after the first round of violence in 2012 led to 140,000 internally displaced Rohingya that were basically herded into camps by the military, by the government. and then not provided much support at all. At what point does the international community have a responsibility to protect their lives and their well-being and need to step in? And to what extent, and I think this cuts to your question, to what extent does feeding, housing, assisting those internally displaced people within those camps then allow the government, allow the military, allow the perpetrators to continue doing what they're doing rather than addressing the underlying issues. I think it's a lot more complicated than that, and it's kind of a bit off topic, but just to sort of endorse in one sense you're saying, but also push back and suggest that actually I think there was a lot more going on in Rakhine with the international and the local development agencies working. There was some ignorance and some sort of missteps, I suspect, but I think it's a lot more complicated than to suggest that the development actors contributed to what became extreme violence, if not violent extremism.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. I'm overwhelmed to hear the stories and your research conducted in my region as a Mindanaoan. I think anyone can answer from the panel, especially on the development NGO context. Or in your research, initial findings, is there a recommendation on how do you envision the development looks like in the next few years, especially in the context of Mindanao, where civil society organizations, in international development NGOs, because I remember when we had a government project on young people and violent extremism, some group of CSOs called our attention because why did we use the concept of violent extremism? But we also know that these development NGOs, their projects are on violent extremism, and the donor funding are actually on the flavor of violent extremism. So, and we also know that the CSOs, they are no like unified group of CSOs because they're also like competing on the projects and funding, etc., etc. But is there any like how your research can anticipate or envision what the development NGO looks like, especially in conflict affected areas in Mindanao, for example?
This is the goal of our research, and we're in the early stages of it. Sorry. Yeah, we'll get back to you an answer in 2 years, okay? Look, I think it's really complicated. There's certainly a lot that development NGOs can do to address some of the issues we're talking about. And there's a lot of really good people already seeking to engage, but I think, and I'll put up a few of their suggestions as the sorts of programs and sorts of gaps. And there are certainly some gaps in programming. For example, widows and the children of fighters from that died in Marawi. There seems to be a gap in programming. So we've identified a range of gaps and so on, a range of issues that they're suggesting that they can work on that seem to intersect with these fairly well. There's still so many big questions, including the evidence of effectiveness question that Leanne raised. It's very, very scant that this actually then leads to a decline in violent extremism. And in this context, that's really a complicated. Can these approaches reduce conflict overall, all these forms of conflict? And certainly can NGO-led, as opposed to big political changes in the state and the structure of the state, address these sufficiently to end or reduce conflict violence in Mindanao significantly? That's a really hard question.
Yeah. Thank you so much for it. Just in addition, because NGOs, especially in the local level, are playing with the political power. I think one of the challenges you put there is that the local government units only has 3 years as one term, because it's very relevant as to how NGO works, because they have to play with the local politicians so that their projects will succeed. So I think that's a major challenge that I'm looking forward to.
We've got 5 minutes. Any more questions? Oh, one over there. About 2.
Hi, and thanks for the presentations. I was wondering about this idea or the notion of hateful extremism, and I wanted to ask a little bit more about whether you see this as a way of maybe addressing the diversity of types of extremism that we now see, whether you see this a little bit linking up with what an earlier presenter termed the dehumanizing speech, and whether you also feel like this could be maybe a way of maybe addressing recruiting or maybe the distribution of these ideologies. Yeah, that's my question.
Thanks. Yeah, well, the answer is all of the above. I think it broadens our understanding of the sort of extremist spectrum and the back and forth complex dynamics and intersections, and obviously individual trajectories. Often people in the same movement have quite different personal experiences and personal motivations. But that question of contempt and hate and othering and dehumanizing is a common feature across all expressions of extremism, including those that don't directly engage in violence. And I think, obviously, you don't want to conflate a focus on hate as a predictor and say that we're focusing on hate because we want to stop violence, because hate in itself and hate acts in themselves cause damage and undermine society. Flip side is that it's much easier to engage with communities to address a common felt need. And if they're experiencing stigma and discrimination, engaging with them on that is a common net benefit, rather than going to them and saying, we're concerned about you because you're vulnerable to radicalization, and therefore that makes them, gives them a sense of being stigmatized as the problem, rather than victims who need help and support. So I think it's a more holistic way of framing things, and leads, I think, to a better analytical understanding. As I said, in the case of West Mindanao, conflict violence is a different dynamic again, and I think it's perhaps, that's a very crude model of the triangle, but it's a start towards thinking about going beyond just a linear framing of violent extremism.
Thanks. That question maybe relates to the one that I've only semi-formulated in my head. You talked about how PCVE frameworks, they're probably developed in other contexts, probably more Western contexts, and then the translation piece into kind of local context and everything like that too. And that's a fair point. I'm wondering though, if the kind of innovation that has to be used in some of these development kind of context, is there something, it's an anthropological question, is there something we in the West can learn for our CVE programs from the way in which you're having to implement some of these initiatives on the ground in some of these contexts? And even, Greg, your answer just in around you've found hateful extremism to be a more useful paradigm to fit within development context. I think we could have done that a long time ago in Australia too. Broad question. What can we learn from your experiences in a Western context?
I think from the project overall, I think that it's a bit too preliminary. We don't have enough comparative data or anything at this stage. But Greg, did you have anything?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question to frame, because we don't have time to go into some of the details, but there's a whole lot of things that are already obvious. But also just framing that question that way is a more respectful way of engaging, and is likely therefore to be more constructive and more fruitful. If we come to a community and say, here's a problem that we've identified, and it seems just to have this sort of foreign formulation that doesn't fit naturally with, and it doesn't, people's first response in terms of felt needs don't reflect that. They're only doing the response they're doing because that's where the donor money is coming from, and that's not helpful for anyone. It's much better if we inductively let them lead and saying, well, these are the things that concern us. So with our pilot project, when we spoke to people, particularly in Indonesia, in Myanmar, they didn't really resonate with the term violent extremism. Leanne did fieldwork, so I'll maybe speak about that. But they expressed other concerns, which make sense when you think about it. But it was much better to let them speak in their own terms. In Indonesia in particular, they did express this view that, okay, the state's doing a pretty good job of dealing with violent extremism. We know it's a problem. We know they're dealing with it. The police do that, fine. But what we're experiencing with my kids at school is something else. And that's our everyday concern. And we're anxious it's getting worse, and we want to do something about it. I don't know, Leanne, do you want to add?
Probably not just, they said there was like increasing conservatism and
yes,
yeah, other sort of hateful narratives going on.
But that came out of them expressing what they were experiencing.
I might also add that preliminary study identified in the Philippines and in Myanmar in particular the perception of security forces in both countries and state actors perpetrating extreme violence that could probably be classified as violent extremism, and they wanted a better way of being able to describe that because the framework of violent extremism didn't allow them to describe that in the same big picture.
Okay, thanks so much for all the work that you're doing in this area. I think the focus on hateful extremism really brings to the fore something that's almost emerging as a theme out of this conference, and that's about the who and the when of interventions. There is an argument to be made that the further upstream we go on this, the more we invite certain kinds of government intrusion into our lives, into our thinking, to our feelings, perhaps in ways that countermand, other values, other principles, other structures that we also think are important. But I'm also keenly aware of how this varies across geopolitical and cultural contexts. So in this region, Indonesia, Philippines, in that Southeast Asian context, what are the dynamics that you see as being at stake in the shift away from the violent in violent extremism, and the role of government and the extent to which governments can use hateful extremism as what you might call another route in to a more perhaps interventions that are not necessarily going to be comfortable.
The one thing I would say to that is that I think hateful extremism is probably a more comfortable fit for non-government and for civil society actors to engage with than violent extremism is, and perhaps framing it away from government and government intervention to the way civil society groups work within society on these issues might be more relevant.
Yeah, and the other point, you speak about the danger, and it's an important thing to bear in mind. To keep on making this point, I think it's important for us as practitioners and analysts to be clear about this, that yes, let's think beyond just violence, but let's slip into a kind of thought policing bad ideas. The issue is bad behavior. Bad behavior can involve physical violence, but it can also involve a dehumanizing, hateful, even just speech acts in itself. And that's, so long as that's kept clear, then I think we're safe. I think what's very clear in Indonesia, and I think maybe at the Philippines as well, is that going with a positive narrative that's established and accepted about pluralism, about this being part of national identity, about valuing diversity, that's a good basis to build upon.
Sorry, I think you've misunderstood the question. Can you keep government out? That's the question. That's the question.
That's a big philosophical question for 5 minutes into lunchtime. But
it's the one I want
a short response is that if the answer is no, then let's help government do something useful rather than something unuseful.
Up to you, Mo. You can close us off.
And with that, can you please join me in thanking the presenters today?